How's everybody doing today? So this is a remake of a video that I made like a week ago, and I have finally just got around to like editing it and putting it up today. And when I was doing that, I realized that there was like a chunk of time during the video when apparently I covered the microphone with my hand, and so you couldn't hear what I was saying. So it was totally useless, and I figured I'd just re-record it. Anyway, backstory aside, what I want to talk about today is the idea of looking at inventions in history through kind of a different than usual lens. Specifically, I want to bring to you the idea that nuclear weapons might be one of the greatest life-saving inventions in human history. Now, I think for most of us, when you talk about the effects that nuclear weapons have had on history, the first things that spring to mind are the detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their ending of World War II. Now, a lot of people have, both at the time as well as in the years since, made the argument that there were probably millions of U.S. soldiers whose lives were saved by those detonations. Soldiers who would have died manually storming Japan, going through the Pacific the rest of the way, island by island, coming up and then eventually invading the mainland of Japan. I think that I've heard the death toll put it around 1 million U.S. soldiers. And that doesn't even include the Japanese soldiers who would have been killed, Japanese civilians who would have been killed, possibly Allied soldiers who may have gotten involved. It seems most likely to me that either Australia or Russia would have been in a position to get involved in that conflict as far as allies of the United States that were in the area. Of course, the rest of the Axis powers were in Europe and were already on their last legs at this point. But all that aside, I'm willing to completely dismiss any possibility that that saved lives, because either way you look at it, it saved lives through killing thousands of people. So, we could put that argument completely to the side and say maybe the war would have just ended itself the next day and, nuclear weapons didn't save anybody in World War II. The more interesting thing that I want to discuss, or I want to look at, is what the Cold War would have become without nuclear weapons. Now, if you're not familiar, the Cold War was a decades-long period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the main things that it revolved around was the idea of communism versus capitalism, and the Soviet Union's style of governance versus the American style of governance. So, the long story short is that this never evolved into an open conflict between the United States and Soviet Union, although there were some smaller conflicts involved, the ones that come to mind being the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But in all of these instances, it was one of the two countries fighting a military force backed by and supported by the other country, but not directly fighting each other. And while all of these were terrible situations that led to the deaths of American and Soviet soldiers, as well as those fighting against them and allied with them, none of these, or I should say all of these instances, even combined, pale in comparison to World War I or World War II. And I don't think it's hard to imagine. As a matter of fact, I think it's the most likely scenario that any open conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States at this time would have resulted in World War III. Now, if we take nuclear weapons off the map, that's pretty much an inevitability, because the main thing that was keeping these two countries in check is a fear of mutual destruction. The idea that if one of them were to launch a nuclear weapon at the other would retaliate, probably by launching nearly their full arsenal. Every major city center would be wiped out, every major population center completely annihilated, and not to mention the long-term effects of poisoning the air and water and probably destroying the atmosphere that the detonation of that many nuclear weapons with that high of a yield, all in rapid succession, would probably have. This fear was actually so omnipresent for the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union that conceptual or actualized projects like Dead Hand were created, which the idea behind this was literally that it was a program designed to launch all of the Soviet Union's nukes at the United States at key strategic points should the entire Soviet Union leadership be killed themselves. This was their failsafe. These two countries were bound together by the fear that if we fight each other, if we start attacking each other, we're both going to be wiped off the map. It's an inevitability. And that is crazy and harrowing and stressful as that sounds. That fear saved countless lives. Because if we look at, even excluding nuclear weapons, if we look at what World War III at this point would have been compared to World War I and World War II, we now have jets capable of, long distance travel and much more effective air-to-ground combat. We have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have so many other things, even taking the nuclear warheads off those missiles that would have been delivering them is still frightening, because you still have the capability of the United States and Soviet Union launching constant barrages of missiles at key population centers. The Bering Sea would have become a bloodbath. Europe would have become a bloodbath. Much more advanced weaponry. And there is no reason to think, if we look at history leading up to this point, the history of the United States getting involved in conflicts leading up to this point, the history of the Soviet Union getting involved in conflicts leading up to this point, the history of conflicts escalating over the past 50 years or so prior to this, in which we had World War I and we had World War II. There is no reason to think that this would have become anything less than the Soviet Union and any nation that would ally with them, likely China, likely North Korea, probably a few other, all the nations within the Iron Curtain, opposed with America and all of their allies, France, the United Kingdom. All of these countries were already geared up for war and ready to go. They had just come off the back of World War II. The military-industrial complex on both sides was firing on all cylinders. This would have been, honestly, just thinking about it off the top of my head, a conflict like this, I wouldn't be surprised if the death toll reached a quarter to a third of the human population at this point in time. And really, there is no reason that this did not happen other than nuclear weapons. The only reason that there was never any sort of invasion or never any sort of conventional weapons attack launched by either one of these super aggressive, super on edge, superpower nations at this point in time, is that they knew that the retaliation would have been a tactical nuclear strike. That's all there is to it. The point I'm trying to make is, as horrible as nuclear weapons are on their surface, as terrible as their immediate repercussions are, even, if we look past the Cold War into today, Pakistan and India have been on the verge of conflict for decades. And the entire reason that neither one of them has ever launched an all-out invasion against the other is that they've both had nukes pointed at each other the entire time. And neither one of them wants to incur the wrath of the other's nuclear weapons program. The reason that countries don't themselves launch nukes is that they know that the retaliation would be the combined might of all the other nuclear powers in the world. So nuclear weapons not only are the deterrent against themselves, they're also the deterrent against the type of conventional warfare that we saw continuously escalating and finally capping off in World War I and World War II. Warfare up until that point had kept bumping it up from guys with swords and spears on horseback, to muskets, to, what we had in those wars. And it couldn't have escalated anymore. If it escalated beyond World War II, to an even higher level of combat, to an even more devastating, power level of all-out warfare, there wouldn't have been much left. It would have knocked society back, maybe not to the Stone Age, but probably to the Middle Ages. And the reason that didn't happen was that all of a sudden, with the introduction of nuclear weapons, and more importantly, with a first example of their actual capabilities in warfare, because I think that without the Hiroshima and Nagasaki detonations, I don't think that they would have been taken as seriously. But people had this first-hand example of what they could actually do, what they were actually capable of. And I think that without that leap in power, that point when the power of human weapons reached this level that was so catastrophic, I think that we would have kept going, and I think that we would have wiped ourselves out. And I think that we have nuclear weapons to thank for a lot of our lives today, because you don't see warfare anymore on the level that you used to see it back then, and especially not on the level of the world wars. And the reason is that everybody knows that it would end in a nuclear catastrophe, and nobody wants that, because it's a lose-lose situation. So there you go, there you have it. That is my argument for why nuclear weapons have probably saved more lives than any other singular invention in human history. You guys have a great day. I hope I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all of that stuff. And, peace.